When this painting was first shown in Paris, it was met with silence. A year later, in London, people paid money and stood in line for hours just to see it. The gap between those two reactions says almost everything about why this painting terrified the people who commissioned the ship in the first place. This is the Raft of the Medusa, painted in 1818 and 1819 by a 27-year-old French artist named Théodore Géricault. It shows the survivors of a real shipwreck, adrift on a makeshift raft, reaching toward a tiny ship on the horizon. This isn't a myth, or a biblical scene, or an ancient battle, the kind of subject painters were expected to choose. It happened 3 years before Gericault painted it, and everyone in France already knew the story. Painters of this era were expected to elevate the past gods, kings, ancient heroes. Gericault instead chose a shipwreck that had made headlines in the newspaper. His own father probably read at breakfast. Here's where the real scandal starts, long before anyone reached that raft. The ship, a French frigate called the Méduse, was commanded by a man named Hugues du Roy de Chaumeries. He hadn't commanded a ship at sea in roughly 20 years. He got the job anyway because he was a royalist nobleman, appointed after the monarchy was restored in 1814, rewarded for loyalty, not competence. In July of 1816, under his command, the Méduse ran aground off the coast of West Africa in calm, well-documented waters that a competent crew should have avoided easily. This wasn't an isolated bad decision either. After the monarchy's return, veteran officers who'd served under Napoleon were pushed aside across the French Navy, replaced by nobles whose main qualification was which family they'd been born into. Chaumeries was simply the name attached to the disaster that finally made the pattern impossible to ignore. The Méduse wasn't just sailing anywhere. It was leading a small convoy to formally reclaim the colony of Senegal, handed back to France after Napoleon's final defeat. On board was the man appointed to govern that colony, Colonel Julien Desire Schmeltz, along with his wife, his daughter, and a notable amount of personal luggage. By some accounts, Schmeltz himself had pressured Chaumeries to keep sailing fast and close to the coast, against more cautious advice trading safety for speed. Days before anything went wrong, and when the ship ran aground, rank decided who lived in comfort and who didn't. Schmeltz was reportedly carried to a lifeboat, still seated in his armchair, accompanied by his family and several heavy chests of belongings, while ordinary soldiers and sailors were left to build a raft out of whatever timber they could find. Weigh those two images against each other for a second. A colonial governor, settled into his own furniture, rowed calmly toward the coast, and not far behind him, roughly 150 people nailing together loose planks, with no idea yet that the ropes connecting them to safety were about to be cut. The ship didn't have enough lifeboats for everyone on board, a problem that became fatal almost immediately. Around 150 people were crowded onto that hastily built wooden raft, initially towed by the lifeboats carrying the ship's officers and more privileged passengers, governor included. Then the tow ropes were cut. Whether by accident or on purpose is still debated, but the raft, and everyone still on it, was set adrift alone. Chaumeries and Schmeltz both reached the African coast safely within days. By most accounts, neither man showed much urgency afterward about the 150 people they'd left behind. What followed lasted 13 days. Starvation, dehydration, and seawater poisoning set in almost immediately. Fights broke out over the little food and wine that had made it onto the raft. By the accounts of the survivors themselves, published just a year later, the ordeal descended into mutiny, murder, and cannibalism among the people trapped on that raft. Of the roughly 150 people who started on it, only around 15 were still alive when they were finally spotted and rescued. By most accounts, the ship that finally found them, the Argus, was in the area on other business connected to the wreck itself, not on a dedicated search for raft survivors. By then, few people expected anyone out there to still be alive. The numbers dropped fastest in the first few nights. By multiple survivor accounts, an early mutiny broke out between officers and the soldiers and sailors crammed onto the raft, and dozens didn't survive that first violent night alone. In the days after, weaker survivors were reportedly thrown overboard by the stronger ones, purely to stretch what little food and water remained. This is exactly the timeline Gericault chose not to soften when he sat down to paint it 2 years later. A 25-year-old painter named Théodore Géricault read the survivors' published account and couldn't stop thinking about it. He didn't just read the book. He tracked down and personally interviewed survivors, asking them to describe exactly what they'd seen and felt. He even had a scale model of the actual raft built in his studio, so he could study exactly how light and shadow would fall across its surface. To get the colour of death right, Gericault didn't rely on imagination. He studied real corpses at a hospital morgue, sketching how skin tone shifts as a body decomposes. By multiple accounts, he brought severed limbs and other body parts back to his own studio, keeping them there for days at a time so he could paint their exact colour as they decayed. He reportedly locked himself away for months while working, shaving his head so he wouldn't be tempted to go out in public and refusing most visitors. By some accounts, friends who did manage to see him during this period described a man who seemed almost as consumed by the story as the survivors themselves had been by the raft, living inside the disaster, alone, long after the real survivors had already gone home. And here's the part of the story that has nothing to do with paint or corpses, at all the part about what happened after Gericault finished. When the painting debuted at the Paris Salon in 1819, it wasn't celebrated as a masterpiece. It was met with a distinctly cool, uneasy reception. The reason wasn't really about technique, it was about politics. This painting was a direct, unmistakable accusation against a monarchy that had just been restored to power, proof, in oil paint and enormous scale, of exactly the kind of corruption and negligence that monarchy represented. The government's own response barely counted as an endorsement at all. Gericault wasn't even the first person the government tried to silence over this story. Two of the actual survivors, a ship surgeon named Jean Baptiste Savigny and an engineer named Alexandre Corillard, wrote their own account of what happened and published it in 1817. They expected recognition, maybe even compensation, for surviving and telling the truth. Instead, they faced fines and the threat of prison for embarrassing the government with their own story. They published it anyway. The book became an outright bestseller, running through multiple editions and translations, within a few years proof that the public wanted this story told, even when the state actively didn't. Gericault built his entire painting on that same book 2 years later, and then watched his own government respond to him almost exactly the way it had responded to them. 3 separate attempts to simply describe what happened on that raft: a memoir, a trial, and a painting, and the state's reaction to all 3 followed the same pattern: minimize it, delay it, quietly discourage anyone else from paying too much attention. He was convicted of incompetent navigation and of abandoning ship before every passenger was off, and sentenced to just 3 years in prison. Observers at the time widely called the trial a whitewash. A painting this size depicting this exact scandal, arriving in Paris just 2 years after that lenient verdict, was never going to be received as simple entertainment. So Gericault took the painting somewhere else entirely. In 1820, he shipped it to London, where it was exhibited at William Bullock's Egyptian Hall. English audiences, with far less political stake in embarrassing the French monarchy, reacted completely differently. Paying crowds lined up to see it. Turning the exhibition into a genuine commercial hit the kind of success the painting had been denied at home. There is an extra layer of irony in choosing England. Specifically, France and Britain had been enemies for a generation, right up until Napoleon's final defeat, just a year before this shipwreck happened. Gericault's most receptive audience for a painting about French national shame turned out to be the country France had most recently been at war with. One more detail hiding in this canvas would only become obvious decades later. The young man lying face down in the foreground, arms stretched toward the viewer, was modelled by a friend of Gericault's, a fellow painter named Eugène Delacroix. Delacroix would go on to become one of the defining painters of the entire Romantic movement in his own right. His first appearance in major art history is lying face down, playing a corpse in someone else's masterpiece. Gericault himself never lived to see how far that movement he'd helped launch would go. He died in 1824, at 32, after a long decline following a series of riding accidents, 5 years after finishing the painting, and only a handful of years before Delacroix picked up where he'd left off. Despair and hope, painted as a single continuous structure, with no clean line separating where one ends and the other begins. So look at this raft, one more time, the exhausted bodies in the foreground, the small cluster of survivors, straining toward a ship that almost didn't see them in time, a captain who hadn't sailed in 20 years, promoted for his bloodline instead of his skill, a governor carried to safety in his own armchair, while soldiers built a raft out of scraps, a raft cut loose and left to drift. 13 days that turned ordinary people into subjects of starvation, violence, and things no survivor's account describes easily. 2 survivors punished for telling the truth, and a painter who studied real corpses to get that same truth right, quietly punished by his own government for succeeding. A trial that let the man actually responsible walk free in 3 years, and a painting that had to cross an ocean before anyone was willing to really look at it. Gericault didn't invent a single part of this horror. He just made sure nobody in France could look away from it twice.